Hi, my name is Orrin Wang from the University of Maryland at College Park. I want to thank Andrew Briquette, David Sigler, and the Keats-Shelley Association of America for kindly inviting me to participate in this important roundtable. I have several responses to the question posed to us about anti-racist practice in the field of Romanticism. I don't think I will say anything that new, but perhaps there is value in saying them again. The first has to do with the material conditions that at the moment underwrite the study of Romanticism itself. Any discussion about the relationship between race and Romantic studies, or more specifically about decolonizing the field, will remain decontextualized and somewhat irrelevant without at least a nod toward frankly appraising the contemporary place of British Romanticism in literary and humanistic studies in North America. By any measure, that place is small and shrinking rapidly, with many watching this video perhaps being the last tenure-track Romanicist in their department. I say this as a senior Romanicist who has devoted my academic career to our field, that this is the historical real we confront, an ever-shrinking market for Romanicists in North America that itself is part of a transformation of university labor marked by the end of tenure-track positions and the rise of a population of university and college lecturers whose job security is often tentative or precarious at best. Romantic studies is rapidly becoming a minor field of study in the way that Deleuze and Guattari conceive of that term. And that any desire to decolonize the field or have it superseded by a different paradigm for the study of 18th and 19th century texts needs to reflect upon how this intellectual and political aspiration takes into account the ever-accelerating, perhaps irreversible forces that are making Romantic studies structurally and materially extraneous within the college and university setting. I'll return to this overarching narrative at the end of my presentation. My second response has to do with questions about the methodology and research that many are nevertheless engaged in that might realize Romantic studies, no matter its larger place in literary or humanistic studies, as anti-racist. To expand the archive of late 18th and early 19th century literature beyond Europe and England, as well as to write race into, make race legible in that very same literature, is fundamentally an historicist act. But what kind of historicism are we talking about, especially for trying to enunciate something as overwhelmingly traumatic and existentially fraught as the Middle Passage? John Drabinski's recent study, for example, on Edouard Glissant has persuasively shown how for Glissant, history doesn't simply recover the past for us. Rather, the events of the past also ask what history and historical methodology might best articulate the past, especially if its events are one of collective horror, violence, and misery that upends notions of easily recoverable memory, linear time, intelligible cause and effect, and transparent grand narratives, a point that we often celebrate in the most powerful literature that narrate the nightmares of history, but which, according to Glissant, still needs to inform the scholarly critical working through of that past. For Glissant, this means realizing a language about Caribbean thought built around philosophical terms, witnessing the specific material horror of the Middle Passage, an ontology of the oceanic abyss into which enslaved Africans were thrown, and a Caribbean subjectivity of opacity founded on the complete loss of the Black body, disappeared into the Atlantic, of any trace of it, that for some readers of Glissant becomes a right of as much as an existential dimension to that subjectivity. Kara Keeling and others have suggested it is from this vantage point that we might interpret the crisis in subjectivity the West has been moving to for some time, which stresses that while Glissant's thought insists on its own specific temporal and geographic coordinates, its implications are simultaneously intended for a world beyond the Caribbean, defined by the global, though necessarily fragmented experience of post-colonial life. I would then ask what kind of Romanticist historicism or literary criticism, for that matter, about the Middle Passage and race might acknowledge and critique its own assumptions about the communicable recovery of transparent literary linear narratives that could radically incorporate within its founding desires the language of the abyss and opacity. This question or challenge from Glissant would be just one example of how an undisciplined romanticism, following Christina Sharp's formulation, will not only involve new areas of study, but also an interrogation into how the discipline and discourse of history trains itself upon an expanding anti-racist 19th century archive. I thus very much applaud especially one purpose of the upcoming conference at Mount Holyoke in June, as it asks how critical race studies can inform the question of the relation between race and romanticism. This is an important task, as necessary as it is challenging to do. Difficult matters demand difficult thought to ensure we can do justice to events whose articulation should never be rote, simple, or reductive. I believe we all agree they deserve more than that. Finally, practicing anti-racism and romanticism means not only rethinking what archive we teach and how we teach it, but also strategically pondering how our field can welcome more faculty and students, both graduate and undergraduate, of color into its midst. This imperative can certainly go hand in hand with the what and how of teaching romanticism, but it would be a mistake to assume that they are essentially linked together. They might at times even be in conflict with one another, and as teachers and scholar critics, we have to be alive to that fact. Put another way, no student of color, especially no undergraduate student, should internalize the belief that they don't have the right to study any archive of literary material, whether it be composed of non-English and non-European literature, or if it be composed of texts from England and Europe. Entailment is deservedly a fraught term for romanticists, but still I would venture that the history of exclusion and marginalization characterizing the education of students of color necessitates a proactive stance by which they learn any literature they read is their literature, to ponder, critique, juxtapose, wrestle with, dismiss, and yes, find pleasure in. They have a right to such texts as they have a right to be in our college and university classrooms. And that leads me back to my initial observation that obviously it is not simply the field of romanticism or even British literary studies or literature of the humanities, but higher education itself that feels the precarity of its standing in our society, an existing precondition in North America, whose vulnerabilities, like those of many other portions of our infrastructure enmeshed in a corporate market system, COVID-19 has so ruthlessly exposed. And that people of color hoping to attain a college degree might disproportionately be affected by this threat to higher education. I would thus stress and refresh the point John Guillory made about the canon wars of the 1990s, that an anti-racist stance in Romantic studies must also see itself as a struggle over something larger, one that involves content and methodology, but also, as important, access as well. However, Romantic studies and literary studies refashion themselves on the other side of this pandemic, whether Romanticism continues to exist, the demands, risks, and rewards of critical thought should be tasked to as diverse an assembly of bodies and subjects, faculty and students, as possible. Thank you.